I would say that my two favorite characters from the MCU are Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, and Steve Rogers, aka Captain America. These two characters are very different from each other, but are great in their own ways. The thing that makes Steve Rogers really interesting is that more than anyone else, he was always fundamentally, purely, at his core, a good person who had a straight arrow morality. He was not. He has his flaws, but they're definitely not as overt as other characters. They're definitely not as overt as Tony's flaws. And we see that even when Steve is in the modern world, which is much more morally gray than World War II, Steve never actually stops being an inherently good person. Back during World War II, things were a lot more clear cut. Nazis bad, the US good. So when Steve wakes up in the modern day, he understandably struggles to adjust to this world that he doesn't know, that he's not familiar with. And one of the things he struggles with the most is the fact that he sees that things are not as black and white now. It's not as clear who exactly the bad guys are. I mean, back in Captain America the First Avenger, Steve was very much a government man. Not to say that he blindly followed orders, because he did not. He was willing to disobey orders if he thought that doing so would be the right thing to do. But generally speaking, he did what the government told him to do. He believed that the government was a force for good. But then you get to Captain America the Winter Soldier, and Steve sees S.H.I.E.L.D. being infiltrated by Hydra. Basically, he sees that governments can be corrupted if the wrong people gain power. So that's a big turning point for Steve, where he stops being a government man and becomes more distrustful of authority. Whereas with Tony, he has the exact opposite arc. He starts off thinking that I know what's best. I don't need anyone else to tell me what to do. In Iron Man 2, he basically tells the government to take a flying leap. So he says, I know what's best for me. You are not going to tell me what to do. But then as time goes on, Tony sees that he's his own worst enemy, especially when he creates Ultron in Avengers Age of Ultron, which causes so much trouble for the Avengers. That's why when you get to Captain America's Civil War, Tony is the one who's saying we need government regulation, because he's seen firsthand what can happen when there is not enough regulation in place. Whereas with Steve, by the time he gets to Civil War, he's the one saying that the Sokovia Accords are wrong. Because at that point, he did not trust governments or authorities anymore. With Steve, it's really fascinating to see that even when the world around him is broken, that's the case when Steve wakes up in the modern day, even when the world around Steve is broken, Steve is never broken. He is instead that shining light, that beacon for what America should be, but never is. Then with Tony, he is such a great character arc. In fact, so many lines of dialogue from the first Iron Man film, the first film in the MCU, have so much more weight now that Avengers Endgame has come out. Because Endgame pays off so many lines of dialogue from Iron Man. It's so powerful that Tony started off as so selfish, so arrogant, egotistical, narcissistic. He had such a big ego. And yet, in the end, he's the one who lays down his life for the universe. In the end, Tony does what he said before he couldn't do. He makes the sacrifice play. He willingly chooses to be selfless, to sacrifice himself for the sake of the universe. It's so powerful to see that he's come so far. Whereas with Steve, as far as I'm concerned, he is the paragon of the MCU. It's really interesting that he just has this old school black and white morality in that no matter what happens around him, he never stops being an inherently good person.